Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. We talk a lot about the challenges or problems facing the industrial sector when it comes to cybersecurity. I mean, it's basically why this podcast exists. So it's nice to start out the show talking about some solutions. Due to the rise in attacks on manufacturing and critical infrastructure and the devastating impacts those attacks have on daily lives around the world, the World Economic Forum unveiled a report entitled Building a Culture of Cyber Resilience in Manufacturing. This initiative not only identified the sector's primary challenges for developing a culture of cyber resilience, but also formulated 3 guiding principles for establishing an enduring strategy for developing a cyber resilient culture. They are the first, which is making cyber resilience a business priority, which the report describes as embedding cyber resilience in the organization's DNA or foundational structure, from the leadership to the shop floor. The second was to drive cyber resilience by design, or integrate cybersecurity into people, processes, and assets. Finally, engage and manage the ecosystem, which the paper states can be accomplished by building trusted partnerships, manage third-party risks, and raise security awareness by identifying the key stakeholders. We're fortunate enough to have one of the key contributors to the creation of these strategies with us today. It's my pleasure to welcome Chris Lovejoy, Global Security and Resilience Leader at Kyndryl, a leader in cyber resiliency strategies and services, to the show. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. So I got to ask, with your company being very diverse in terms of the different markets it works in, the different areas of expertise that it has, what drew you to also getting involved in manufacturing? Because we've heard from a lot of firms that it's a different animal and can be very challenging at times.
Yeah, and I've been working in the manufacturing industry for, some time. Throughout my career, I've had clients that were in the field. But it wasn't really until a few years ago that I really jumped in headlong. And it was, I was working a security incident, and I can't reveal the company, but the context was manufacturing organization who was creating baby formula. And at the time, this was, kind of just at as COVID was beginning, and this actor was trying to disrupt the baby formula, kind of the supply chain, so that they could create some social consternation and, disrupt some events that, in the background, et cetera. And, it really struck me that, we as an industry aren't necessarily taking into account the very specific risk associated with manufacturing industry. They work in such a different way. They use such different technologies. The people that work in those industries have such a different culture. And there is a requirement that you specialize in order that you actually help those organizations in, solving the problems without, really actually hurting the business performance.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up culture, because I would agree with you 100%. It is unique. Could you offer a little perspective there, maybe in some of the other industries you work with, and why manufacturing sort of has a different take on things, or what some of those differences might be?
What I find in manufacturing is, most manufacturers have a, sort of the IT and then the OT side of the organization, from an engineering and an operations perspective. You have the folks that manage the production lines, and then you have kind of the IT folks that are creating the systems, like the logistics systems, et cetera, that, are required. And, what happens is the production line folks, they have the safety first mentality. So everything is about safety and production line performance. Nothing can go down. And because nothing can go down, what happens is they don't want to upgrade systems. They don't want to secure those, not necessarily not secure them, but they don't want to configure them in any way that's going to hurt the performance of those systems. Meanwhile, the IT folks are more into let's throw more technology at it, let's upgrade, let's do all this. So there's kind of this dichotomy between the two. And I do think, today with IIoT, IoT, 5G, a lot of these buzzwords that, some of the listeners might not necessarily understand, but suffice to say, they are the technologies that enable those production lines to be connected to the internet. Because that is happening, it's introducing more risk. And so the requirement to actually have conversations with the production line leaders who own these systems and are required for securing them, it's just a very, very different kind of conversation that you have on the other side.
Very true. We've talked a lot about those silos for IT and OT and manufacturing. And I think over the last probably 5 years, there's been a lot of work done in trying to break those down and get people working together. What are you seeing there in working? I can see you nodding your head that we're trying, but we're maybe not getting there as quickly as we should. What's been your experience in working with manufacturers and trying to get those two entities talking to each other?
I think there's some organizations that are leading, right? And they tend to be the kind of manufacturers of those goods and services that may not be, critical infrastructure. So oil, gas, food, chemicals, the things that we rely on every day to survive, those tend to lag a bit in comparison to those organizations that are able to drive. I think a lot of it, interestingly enough, is more about the financing of the equipment that is used to support the production than it is actually a cultural issue per se. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the companies that are critical infrastructure industries, some of them are publicly supported, like energy generation companies that are tied to utilities, as an example. Some of them are just capital heavy or capital intensive industries. The way they fund their operations is through the deployment of capital. Right? What happens with capital is you buy equipment, you deploy that equipment, and then you depreciate that equipment over a long period of years. Organizations that are not critical infrastructure, they tend to have a bit more flexibility in funding. They can move to what we call, an OpEx model. And so what they're doing is they're paying to use technology as kind of an added drink perspective. They've already moved their SAP systems to the cloud. They're already kind of pushing forward. And so when it comes to technology that is fixed, you tend not to want to change that technology because of the funding model. Whereas if you're a cloud model, an OpEx model, you can afford to change the security in and around it. So I think there's a dynamic, which is there is culture, but there is also the financing, which kind of underpins how things operate as well.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And so I'm wondering then, one of the issues that we run into when it comes to OT security is there's so much to get after. You talked about IoT and what that's doing and creating all these new connection points and all this new data flowing to different places. Where do you typically start when you start working with a manufacturer? Is it identifying? Is it just getting better visibility? Is it looking at certain asset management practices? What is a good place to start?
Well, again, it depends on the maturity of the organization. But, when we're talking to the more immature organizations, step one is just figuring out what they have and what connections to the internet they may have lurking out there. I mean, it's a very basic issue, but a lot of organizations still don't have a good inventory. Those inventories are, sort of managed in a very bespoke manner, sometimes, line by line by line. There's not a lot of data integration. There's not a lot of good understanding as who's actually maintaining that equipment and how. They'll have people coming in and, maintaining the production lines from third-party suppliers using iPads, and they don't realize that that's creating, kind of an entrance into the organization. Then you have the other side, the much more kind of dynamic and, more modern organizations. And again, where you start there is less about finding stuff because they know it. And it's more about how do you move forward and, create microsegmentation? How do you create the kind of the networks and the technology data infrastructures, the AI-based analytics capabilities that really allow them to increase their overall efficiency and decrease the number of defects? So it's a very different kind of starting place.
No, absolutely. Makes a ton of sense. You've mentioned maturity a couple of different times in terms of how that impacts the OT, the security environment, and what steps need to be taken. I'm assuming this kind of relates also to the size of the organization. And I bring this up because it feels like we still have this misrepresentation throughout manufacturing where the smaller guys don't think they're a target. They feel like we're too little. This isn't a priority for us. Nobody's going to mess with us, when the reality is the hackers are just as aware. So is it a maturity and a size thing? Do those things go hand in hand, or what are you seeing there?
It goes back to, we talk a lot about expertise, and I do have a bit of a different perspective, by the way, on kind of the whole workforce, thing. But suffice to say, I do think that there is truth in smaller organizations can't afford somebody who's going to be whispering in the C-suite board's ear about security risk. They just don't necessarily understand it, and that's number one. Number two is because they tend to use providers who are providing kind of packaged services from them. It's like going and buying a car off of the showroom, and you're assuming that the seatbelt is in the car. And they assume that, they're going to just take the car out and they're going to drive that car, and somebody else is going to recall the car if something goes wrong. It doesn't work that way. A lot of the vendors from whom they're actually procuring the technology, if there is a seatbelt, and that's a big if there is one, it's up to the driver to actually click it in and to use it. And so a lot of the smaller organizations, they just don't recognize that is the fact. Then, on your point, they don't realize that they are a risk or pose a risk. They are the biggest risk.
Absolutely.
So let's just be clear. The big issue is, the attackers are going after the weakest point. If you are trying to disrupt manufacturing, where do you go? You go to the smaller suppliers. They are the easiest to target. And oftentimes it's the suppliers of, equipment, safety equipment for the automobile manufacturer. Maybe a chip, depends on the kind of the world is your oyster here. Pick the component part. But those smaller manufacturers tend to be the people that they focus on because they know they can disrupt the larger organization by introducing risk in that supply chain. And oh, by the way, the other area that we see a lot, particularly in manufacturing, is the little ones, the little organizations, those particularly that are creating electronics, producing electronics. We're seeing the attackers try to get malware embedded in those electronics, so that the electronics can act as a Trojan horse into the larger organizations.
Man, yeah, we've talked about that. We had a chip manufacturer on not too long ago, and he went into a lot of that dialogue and those dynamics of those types of attacks, and it leads to a bigger conversation on secure by design, because as you mentioned, that's what a lot of folks are thinking when they're bringing in all of these new technologies, connecting it to legacy equipment. And a lot of times they're assuming everything is good because they bought they bought the latest motor, they bought the latest HMI, whatever the case may be. Not always the case. What's been your experience in just sort of trying to raise awareness about that whole topic and the fact that there's a shared responsibility? It's not just the supplier of the new technology, it's also the buyer that needs to make sure everything is not only connecting right and operating right, but we're secure.
So, personally, I'm tackling this in two different ways. I mean, one, I tend to, with Kyndryl, to work with, my customers tend to be larger organizations that operate mission critical infrastructure. They are in critical industries. They are, managing submarines. I mean, we're talking, big, thorny kinds of projects. Now, we talk to them a lot about third-party supply chain risk and how do you rethink the creation of a hardware bill of materials, a software bill of materials? How do you analyze your third-party vendors? What are the testing mechanisms before you can actually introduce that technology in? So we're doing a lot of that work. And the good news is there is, well, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. There's a lot of regulation today that's driving these organizations to think about third-party risk. And so they're getting their arms around it. That's happening. What's not happening is on, again, the smaller, medium-sized organizations in their ability to kind of fix the problem. A lot of it is because they don't have the expertise, they don't have the money to do it. So what I'm talking a lot, this is where I talk to policymakers. I think fundamentally the economics of security affordability is working against small and medium-sized businesses in this arena. It is really, really hard for them. And I really worry, based on what I'm seeing the larger organizations do, that a lot of these smaller organizations are going to be driven out of business because they can't afford the cost of the security control that is going to be required. And so there has to be a different public funding model, I believe, to enable some of these smaller and medium-sized businesses, particularly those that are dependent on capital, like energy generation, water utility, those sorts of things. They have got to have a different mechanism for being able to acquire, or at least get tax benefits for the acquisition and deployment of technology. Otherwise, we're going to have an upside down model where the folks that are on the ground of building the most important capabilities for us, they're going to be marginalized. And what we're going to see is, huge organizations scooping this up because they can afford to deal with the issues.
Wow, that's a really interesting perspective, and there's a lot of context to it. When we look at, I reference this quite a bit, but that PLC hack that ended up, it was targeted, basically had political motivations targeting plants in Israel, and ended up impacting water treatment facilities here in the U.S., and that even led to breweries and other just beverage manufacturers as well. So it is a scary thought to think if there are not the funds available and if there isn't some support provided to, like you said, the small and medium, not just businesses, but the municipalities as well. We could really enter a very scary time, not only in terms of availability, but just when you think about the pricing dynamic and what that would do to the supply chain if you did eliminate a lot of those businesses.
Absolutely. And, there's one thing, I know as a security person that, all kidding aside, there are certain assets that when you disrupt, like beer, water is bad.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
People get upset.
Well, and that's what the hackers are counting on. They're counting on that outrage and basically, okay, you have no choice now. You don't want to deal with this. The real easy solution is pay us and it'll go away.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a lot of different challenges that we could talk about. One that you mentioned that I was hoping we could dive into a little bit more deeply is cloud security. This has become a much bigger issue for manufacturers, I think largely because a lot of times when you're working with a large cloud provider, you think it's in the cloud, I'm working with Microsoft, I'm working with Amazon, we're good. And that's not really the case, and we found that out.
Yes, you're poking at one of my favorite topics, and I'm not gonna dive into all the details because there's a ton of things that you can talk about, related to cloud risks. But I think the most important is that there's moving to the cloud, and then there's moving to the cloud. And when I say that in so much as many organizations will say in the manufacturing space, we moved to the cloud. They didn't actually move to the cloud. What they did is they took legacy technology. They put the legacy technology into a container. Then they moved the container to the cloud. That's not actually moving to the cloud, because what you have not done is you haven't refactored your applications to be cloud native and therefore available or able to be secured by cloud, by natively. What happens when you take old stuff that gets older every day, surprise, you move it to the cloud within a container. Now, not only do you have to continue to manage and secure that legacy infrastructure, but now you have to manage the containers as well. So that's adding extra complexity. So that complexity introduces security risk. And as I said, many manufacturers didn't actually refactor these applications. They just moved the old stuff to the cloud. So that is one big issue that organizations have to recognize. The second big issue is on the APIs that are used, for cloud hosted applications. These, APIs are really crucial for enabling communication and data exchange between, various components of the cloud applications. A lot of what we find is a lot of these APIs often are exposed in such a way that sensitive data can be accessed, that these particular things can be, these APIs can be disrupted, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one kind of issue, what two issues I'd say that are very, very strongly related, but two issues is, migration to the cloud isn't taking old stuff and moving it. It's actually refactoring. And again, a lot of these manufacturing organizations, because of the way they capitalize, I won't get into the financial details, but you can't capitalize parts of the software development process. Because you can't do that, they tend not to refactor the applications.
No, all sorts of issues. And I'm glad you brought up the stuff about APIs, because one of the sort of evolutions that we're seeing in the threat landscape is there's a lot of bad actors who are focused on nothing more than penetrating those APIs and corrupting those calls. The amount of damage that can be done there, not just with cloud networks, but just within the enterprise is terrifying. So that's definitely an area of increased focus going forward for the industrial sector.
Yeah, and I'd also say, by the way, I'm seeing a lot of denial of service attacks. It seems almost ridiculous, but it's like they forgot somehow that they actually have to buy DOS protection, and so we're just seeing a lot of exposure there.
Do you think that stems, and I can see both sides of this question, with those denial of service attacks, a lot of times it seems to me anyways that we're connected to the internet in ways that we don't need to be. Are we over-connected? Are we relying too much on those connection points to share data?
I do think so. I think it's the same issue we have with just having a plethora of technologies that we have yet to inventory. We have a lot of network access points that we have yet to understand, and we keep adding them. And this is it's interesting. I think larger organizations, again, going back to kind of the affordability. A lot of them are moving to private 5G implementations. They're laying dark fiber. They're actually, they're air gapping their facility, their industry, their kind of manufacturing lines from the internet, but they're still able to communicate. Whereas the smaller organizations, they have to be internet, sort of enabled. So it's an interesting and perplexing topic that I'm not sure we actually have great answers for just yet.
Yeah, very interesting. So we talked about a couple of different types of attacks. You mentioned the denial of service attacks. Ransomware is always an issue. It seems like there's been an uptick in phishing vulnerabilities as well. What do you think are some of the things that we're getting better at as a result of these attacks and maybe sharing information? Because I think the manufacturing sector has gotten better. We're not there yet. We still need to be a little bit more transparent. But have you seen some lessons learned, so to speak, that we can take away and are getting better at defending our enterprises because we're seeing some of these things out there?
I do think so. I think ransomware in particular, I do see a noted decrease in number of ransomware impacts, particularly in the US and Europe. I'm seeing a huge spike in ransomware attacks in Latin America, and seeing a reasonable number in Asia Pac, which has been pretty consistent. So I suspect a lot of the threat actors are recognizing that there's a bit more focused scrutiny in the States and other places. And so therefore, they're just going to those sort of the weakest available spots, and Latin America seems to be the place right now. So I think the threat sharing, the bot takedowns, sort of the takedowns of the various providers, I think that is yielding positive benefit. I think the area where we're getting worse is in phishing detection, anti-phishing capability. I think a lot of that is because of AI. I think we're beginning to see these natural language models, generative AI being used to create incredibly sophisticated multi-vector attacks, which use a variety of media methods. They use, voice and video and email and text and you name it, crafting, like I could tell you about lots of the sophisticated, attacks we're seeing come in. But, whereas you used to try, strive for and get to a, 10 to 20% click rate, because it's like herd immunity. You want to decrease the number of people that can click. Now we're at like 8%. 9% maybe of people are not clicking. The other 92% are clicking. I mean, think about that. You're just totally flip the marketplace. Now, you just have to expect that the endpoint is going to be exposed. And so that's why I think we're seeing, as a result, zero trust is kind of exploding as a concept within this particular market as well.
That is Wow, we've talked about some scary stuff so far in our conversation. That one should really definitely get some people paying attention. And you've mentioned several times how there's an investment problem. People don't want to make the investments in some of these types of security platforms. That stat right there should just reinforce what we need to do at again, one of the more basic areas of business, which is the inbox.
Right.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really simple. So we've talked a lot about the bad stuff that's going on here. Let's talk about some of the good stuff, Chris. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your company and some of the things that Kyndryl has going on.
Oh, yeah. So Kyndryl is, for those of you who don't know us, we're one of the biggest startups, I guess. I guess we can still call ourselves a startup. We came out of IBM about 2.5 years ago. So we're the IT services and strategic outsourcing arm. Since spinning from IBM, we're about 85,000 people or so. We're operating in 56 different countries, manufacturing being one of our core industry focus areas. And we have a number of practices. So we have cloud practice, a mid-range and mainframe practice. We do network implementations. We have digital workplace services, applications, data, and AI practice. Sorry, my brain stopped. I'm in overseas right now and a little bit jet lagged. And then my practice, which is security and resiliency. And so what we're doing is we're bringing those services to our customers using a very novel AI-based delivery platform that we use to enable our services. And so if anybody's interested in finding out more, just go to our website. It's Kyndryl.com. I'm sure you'll put that up, but it's a weirdly named company, but it means Kin, which is family, and drill, which is new shoots. So we're a new family.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Interesting. One of the things that you were working on, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is you actually worked on a paper with the World Economic Forum in talking about dividing these three kind of principles to help drive cybersecurity within an organization. And I thought they were really interesting because a lot of it seemed to be focused on the people, the human element of it in terms of making it a priority and understanding people and processes. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the thoughts that were behind those principles that were put out there and really the role that we overlook this with all the technology that's going on, but humans, workers can have the biggest positive or negative impact really on the cybersecurity health of an organization.
And I think, this market, the security market is I think many of us who have been CISOs would say it is maybe overcapitalized. There are too many, and I love so many of the providers that are out there. They do great stuff, but there are too many tools. And that the tools, the vendors are get to a point where they get so desperate for customers that they don't, I'd say sometimes they creatively enhance the value of their capabilities.
I'm going to steal that. Creatively enhance. I like that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So I'm trying to be a politic. These are good people. They just want to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
But the result is that, organizations, they tend to think about security as being a tool. It's not a process. And security, I keep reminding people, is a process. It's a process of managing risk. It starts with understanding the business and what the business does, understanding how cyber threats can interfere or impact those business operations, the business's customers, the people that are employed by those organizations, figuring out what can happen, and then determining how much money is reasonable to spend on that risk. That's the process of managing risk. It's not a tool. Tools are used to help mitigate the risk, but that's not the answer. Now, any CISO will tell you that the only way that process can be executed effectively is if there is somebody who's setting the tone at the top that it's important, that they care about cyber risk. So step one is you have to set the tone at the top. Step two is you have to make sure everybody in the organization recognizes, just like safety is an issue, just like we tell people when you're coming down the stairs, hold the handrails. When you're on the manufacturing floor, wear a hard hat, or whatever those requirements are. We have to kind of inculcate that kind of culture that security is a risk and needs to be defended against. And so I would say that particularly in manufacturing, because it is a fairly static environment, and humans have an oversized responsibility and obligation to be our eyes and ears and to enforce kind of that risk management process on the ground.
No, absolutely. A couple of great points there, too, in terms of identifying or looking at security as a process. I think that's going to help it resonate more strongly, especially with the smaller manufacturers who are so focused on this is the process. We need to get product out the door. Security is more of another step or a hindrance. Focusing on it as a process should help sell that a little bit more to a lot of those organizations that are struggling to implement it. The other point that you made there, I think, is great, is talking about the influx of tools on the market right now. We hear that all the time from manufacturers in terms of the number of tools they have, and because whenever something pops up and something new shows up that they need to defend against, it's buy a tool, get it in here, let's get set up, to the point now where there's a lot of redundancy, and a lot of those resources you were talking about that could be invested in other places are stuck in all these tools. What advice or perspective can you give folks in just managing tool selection?
And I always hear this because there is a delicate balance between aggregation risk, right? You don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket, but then there's the complexity. And I was talking about the workforce management thing. Okay, let's be realistic. When you have, 1,000 different versions of technologies in your organization, and you need a cybersecurity expert to help manage all of those 1,000 different versions, what do you think happens? You'll run out of money. You can't afford that many people.
Right.
So if you consolidate technology and you bring it down to a manageable set where you can find the skills in an affordable way, then guess what? You can manage them. And so one of the things, talking about security as an opportunity area, what we always recommend, particularly with the manufacturing industry, is start with the concept of, the sort of the business, the production line. Like, how does it work? What are the technologies? What are the processes? What is the data? Who are the people that are involved? Map it out. Do that infrastructure mapping. Then think through, all right, and what is your RTO, for that particular service? Then think to yourself, what are the cyber risks? And then think to yourself, okay, how am I poised to actually protect myself against that? Because at the end of the day, what I want to achieve is overall business resilience. Resilience includes or incorporates the concept of security. And so if we can kind of use that process to not only identify where controls need to be put in place, but also say, hey, gee, if I were to transform this part of the process, if I were to upgrade this technology, if I were to refactor the application and move to the cloud in the right way, maybe not only would I get a better benefit from a production perspective, but guess what? I'd get a security outcome as well. So what we're saying is use security as the means by which you identify modernization opportunities and begin to prioritize modernization based on those overall resilience outcomes as well as the business outcomes. Don't use security as the hindrance. Use it as the business case motivation for actually making the change.
No, that's well said. And I just think of how this is also going to impact digital transformation strategies in terms of making them easier and also providing some of the resources that are necessary, not just from a financial perspective, but from a manpower perspective as well. So that's a great approach in terms of trying to implement a very basic strategy, a very basic tactic, but having multiple impacts.
But vendor consolidation is key to this, and recognizing there's just a cost outlay for this, complexity, and by the way, obsolescence. Biggest issue I see is not that you don't have a monitoring tool or you haven't bought this widget. It's the fact that a lot of these manufacturers are running, 20-year-old versions of 30-year-old versions of technology. Would you drive a 30-year-old car? Probably not, unless it was like a vintage, collectible. Most of our manufacturers are running some pretty old equipment.
Well, and then it goes back to that conversation about if you're going to preserve that old equipment, making sure when you bring in the new tech, all those connection points are right. You use the analogy of a vehicle. I'll take a 30-year-old car if it's got a brand new engine, but I got to make sure it's hooked up correctly and it's running right to make it work. So
right.
Excellent. Chris, this has been awesome. We've covered a lot of different stuff here. Looking forward a little bit, are there any big trends that you're seeing that really could have a bigger impact over the next maybe 12 to 18 months?
And I'm going to be a little bit cynical here because I think, I'm not going to be, let me phrase it differently. AI, we've been talking about, has become a buzzword, right? And even when we started talking about it, I'd say, yeah, it's buzzword. I mean, I had an AI company years ago. And it's like, okay, we've been talking about it, but all of a sudden now we care. Great. I do think, however, that AI is going to be very transformative in the manufacturing industry and for security more specifically. That's one area. Another area that I see a lot of transformation in is drones. Seeing a lot of drone rollout right now. Drones for managing inventory. Drones for checking things like in transportation, energy industries, checking the various pipes and lines. Looking at various facilities to ensure that there's no leaks, things of that nature. Right now, I think there is a big question about, so how do I protect myself against drones? How do I protect my drones? So there is because we're seeing so much innovation coming out of the Ukraine and out of Israel conflicts, and this kind of concept of swarming, this concept of using biomimicry, AI-based biomimicry, so drones can act like animals, which can subvert a lot of the detection capabilities. This is becoming a real issue that I hear a lot when I go on the Hill and I talk to legislators. They're talking about this. And as I said, I'm not sure that there's really good solutions yet. And this is something that I'm really thinking about very carefully right now.
Well, that's really interesting. That isn't one we've had brought up before, but it makes a ton of sense, especially when you look at the types of data that those drones are gathering, especially for critical infrastructure. And if it's sending it back to some homegrown ERP, there's a lot of potential issues there. That's a great point.
Yeah. Well, and also the fact that they can be used as offensive weapons, dropping, biologicals or incendiaries, it's like kind of scary, and they're pretty unregulated. So.
Yeah. Very interesting. And another thing to consider, obviously, when making those types of investments, looking at the security element there as well. So we've talked a lot about stuff that should keep us on our toes, the things that we do need to be aware of. But I have to ask, Chris, you've been involved in cybersecurity for a while. You have your hands in a lot of different cookie jars. When you go to bed at night, what helps you get a good night's sleep when you think about cybersecurity? Are there some things that sort of quell these fears that are going on right now and give you some respite?
Well, I have 4 kids. And so
okay.
I can tell you that my brain was always humming between, okay, what are my sons doing?
Yeah.
Are they getting themselves into trouble now?
Fair.
Or, my daughters, well, anyway, I won't go to there. So I have to say, I've definitely been good at not, thinking through or bifurcating risk issues. I think at the end of the day, what I find is that most people are good, and I know that sounds like a little trite, but I think this is true, that when you see the attackers that are, attacking organizations, most of them, the largest majority of attacks are financially motivated. The attackers really aren't interested in hurting the public. They're interested in making money. And sometimes it's making, yes, maybe they're greedy. Sometimes it's very sad circumstances that they're living in. Sometimes they don't even know what they're doing, right? But people are generally good. They don't attack to deliberately cause harm. They attack because they're looking for a payout. That's the thing that gives me hope, because when, as long as humans continue to be kind of more on the right side than the wrong side, I think we've got a good shot at getting our arms around this.
Thanks, Chris. And for more information on the work she and her colleagues are up to, you can check them out at Kyndryl.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Chris Lovejoy, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.